October 16, 1859. A federal arsenal in Harpers Ferry, Virginia. 21 men, armed with rifles and revolvers, storm the building in the dead of night and take hostages. Their leader is a 59-year-old man with wild gray hair, piercing eyes, and an absolute conviction that God has commanded him to free every enslaved person in America by force. His name is John Brown, and he's about to launch the most audacious attack on slavery in American history. Brown's plan is insane and brilliant in equal measure. Seize the federal weapons, distribute them to enslaved people throughout Virginia, spark a massive slave rebellion, and watch the entire institution of slavery collapse in blood and fire. Within 36 hours, he'll be captured by Colonel Robert E. Lee. Within 6 weeks, he'll be hanged for treason. But his raid on Harper's Ferry will electrify the nation, deepen the divide between North and South, and help trigger the Civil War that will finally destroy slavery. This is the story of John Brown, a man who believed that slavery was such a monstrous evil that violence was not just justified, but morally necessary to end it. Some called him a prophet, others called him a terrorist, but no one could ignore him. This is about faith, violence, justice, and the question that still haunts America. When is violence the answer to injustice? John Brown was born on May 9, 1800, in Torrington, Connecticut, the son of Owen Brown, a strict Calvinist who believed that slavery was a sin against God. The Brown family wasn't wealthy, but they were deeply religious, and from his earliest childhood, John was taught that every human being, regardless of color, was created in God's image and deserved freedom. When John was 5, his family moved to Hudson, Ohio, then the far western frontier of American settlement. John grew up learning to hunt, farm, work with his hands, and most importantly, to read the Bible obsessively. The Bible wasn't just a religious text for the Brown family, it was the lens through which they understood the entire world. Owen Brown taught his children that Scripture demanded active opposition to slavery. This wasn't the moderate, gradual abolitionism that most anti-slavery Northerners practiced. This was the belief that slavery was such a fundamental evil that Christians had a duty to destroy it by any means necessary. When John was 12, an incident occurred that would shape the rest of his life. He was driving cattle through Michigan Territory and stayed with a man who owned an enslaved boy about John's age. The enslaved boy was beaten with fire shovels in front of John for minor infractions. John watched this boy, who could have been his friend, being treated as property and brutalized for sport. The experience traumatized him and planted seeds of rage that would grow for the next 40 years. As a young man, John Brown tried various occupations with mixed success. He worked as a tanner, tried sheep farming, worked as a surveyor, started businesses that frequently failed. He married twice and fathered 20 children, though several died in childhood. Brown moved his family frequently, always searching for better opportunities, always struggling financially, always reading his Bible, and becoming increasingly convinced that God had special plans for him. By the 1830s, the abolitionist movement was growing in the North, but most abolitionists believed in gradual, peaceful means, moral persuasion, political pressure, helping escaped slaves through the Underground Railroad. William Lloyd Garrison, the most famous abolitionist, was a pacifist. Frederick Douglass, the escaped slave and brilliant orator, also initially advocated for peaceful change. John Brown thought they were all wrong. He looked at slavery, an institution where 4 million human beings were held as property, where families were torn apart and sold, where people were worked to death and beaten for sport, and he couldn't understand how anyone thought peaceful persuasion would end it. The slaveholders had wealth, power, and the law on their side. They would never voluntarily give up the system that made them rich. Brown became convinced that only violence could destroy slavery. In 1837, after the murder of Elijah Lovejoy, an abolitionist newspaper editor killed by a pro-slavery mob in Illinois, Brown stood up in his church and raised his right hand. He declared before God that he would dedicate his life to destroying slavery, and that he would not rest until every chain was broken. His family watched, some with pride, some with fear, knowing that John Brown didn't make vows lightly. Throughout the 1840s, Brown became increasingly involved in the Underground Railroad, the network that helped escaped slaves reach freedom in Canada. Unlike most operators who simply provided shelter, Brown armed the escaped slaves he helped, taught them to shoot, and told them to fight back if slave catchers came. His house in Ohio became known as a station where escaped slaves could not only hide but prepare to defend their freedom. In 1854, Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which allowed new territories to decide for themselves whether to permit slavery through popular vote. Both pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers flooded into Kansas, and the territory descended into violent chaos that newspapers called Bleeding Kansas. In 1855, 55-year-old John Brown arrived in Kansas with several of his sons. They had come to claim land and vote against slavery, but Brown had brought something else: crates of rifles, revolvers, and ammunition. Brown hadn't come to Kansas just to vote. He had come to fight. The violence in Kansas escalated throughout 1855 and early 1856. Pro-slavery forces attacked the anti-slavery town of Lawrence, destroying buildings and beating settlers. The territorial government, controlled by pro-slavery forces, passed laws making it illegal to even speak against slavery. John Brown decided it was time to send a message. On the night of May 24, 1856, John Brown led a group including several of his sons to Pottawatomie Creek. They were hunting pro-slavery settlers who had threatened anti-slavery families. What happened that night would make John Brown infamous and cement his reputation as either a freedom fighter or a terrorist. Brown and his men went to 3 cabins inhabited by pro-slavery settlers. They dragged 5 men from their homes in front of their families. Then, using broadswords, they hacked these men to death. The killing was brutal, methodical, and designed to send a message. The Pottawatomie massacre shocked both sides. Even many abolitionists were horrified. But John Brown felt no remorse. He believed these men were guilty of supporting slavery, which he viewed as a form of murder itself. If you participated in the system of slavery, if you defended it, if you voted for it, you had forfeited your right to live. This was biblical justice in Brown's mind: an eye for an eye, blood for blood. The Pottawatomie massacre triggered a cycle of revenge killings throughout Kansas. For the next several months, Brown led a small band of fighters in hit-and-run attacks against pro-slavery settlements. They freed enslaved people, burned pro-slavery settlers' homes, and fought several pitched battles. Brown proved to be a surprisingly effective guerrilla commander. At the Battle of Blackjack in June 1856, Brown's force of about 30 men defeated a pro-slavery militia of over 50. Brown became a celebrity in the North. Newspapers published accounts of his exploits. Abolitionists held fundraising events to support Captain Brown. Wealthy abolitionists, including a group known as the Secret Six, began providing Brown with money and weapons. They saw him as the action wing of the abolitionist movement. But Kansas wasn't enough for John Brown. He had proven that armed resistance to slavery was possible. Now he wanted to take the war into the heart of slavery itself. He wanted to attack the South directly, to spark a slave rebellion that would burn the entire system to the ground. And he had a plan. By 1858, John Brown had developed a plan so audacious that even his supporters thought he might be insane. He would attack a federal arsenal in Virginia, seize thousands of weapons, distribute them to enslaved people throughout the region, and spark a massive slave rebellion that would spread throughout the South. Brown's reasoning: there were approximately 4 million enslaved people in the South, vastly outnumbering white people in most areas. These people desperately wanted freedom and would rise up if they had weapons and leadership. The Appalachian Mountains provided perfect terrain for guerrilla warfare. Once the rebellion started, enslaved people throughout the South would join. Slavery would collapse in blood and fire. The target Brown selected was the federal arsenal at Harpers Ferry, Virginia. The arsenal contained approximately 100,000 weapons, The town was small and could be easily captured. It was located near the Blue Ridge Mountains, providing escape routes into defensible terrain. Brown spent over a year preparing. He rented a farm in Maryland, just across the river from Harpers Ferry, where he secretly gathered weapons and supplies. He recruited 21 men, including 5 black men and 3 of his own sons. Among the black recruits were Shields Green, an escaped slave, and Dangerfield Newby, a freedman trying to buy his enslaved wife and children. Brown also sought the support of Frederick Douglass, the most famous black abolitionist in America. In August 1859, Brown and Douglass met secretly. Brown laid out his entire plan, expecting Douglass to join the raid. Douglass listened carefully, then delivered his verdict. The plan was suicide. Attacking a federal arsenal would bring the full force of the U.S. military down on Brown's head. Enslaved people, while desperate for freedom, might not rise up spontaneously without preparation. Brown was marching into a trap. Brown listened to Douglass's arguments and rejected everyone. He believed God had commanded him to do this. He believed the enslaved people would rise up. He believed that even if he died, his martyrdom would inspire others. The 2 men parted. Douglass convinced Brown was going to his death. On October 16, 1859, John Brown and his 21 men made their move. They crossed the bridge into Harper's Ferry at night. The town was quiet, most residents sleeping. Brown's men quickly overwhelmed the night watchman at the arsenal and took control. They cut telegraph wires. They seized the armory buildings and took hostages, including Lewis Washington, the great-grandnephew of George Washington. The initial phase went perfectly. By midnight, Brown controlled the federal arsenal without firing a shot. Now came the crucial part, waiting for enslaved people from the surrounding area to arrive, arm themselves, and join the rebellion. Brown sent some of his men into the countryside to spread word. But this is where Brown's plan collapsed. The enslaved people didn't come. Brown had made no preparation, no advance warning, no organization. Enslaved people woke up to rumors but had no way of knowing if this was genuine liberation or a trap. Many plantation owners immediately locked down their properties. The rebellion Brown expected simply didn't happen. Worse, word of the raid spread quickly despite the cut telegraph lines. By morning, local militia groups were converging on Harper's Ferry. Townspeople armed themselves and began shooting at Brown's men. The raiders, expecting to be greeted as liberators, instead found themselves under siege. Several of Brown's men were killed. Dangerfield Newby, the freedman fighting to free his family, was shot and killed, his body mutilated by an angry mob. Brown made a catastrophic tactical error. Rather than retreating into the mountains, he withdrew with his remaining men and hostages into the arsenal's engine house, a small brick building. This gave them a defensible position, but it also trapped them. There was no escape route. They were surrounded by hundreds of armed militiamen. By the evening of October 17th, 10 of Brown's men were dead or dying. His remaining fighters were trapped and running low on ammunition. But Brown refused to surrender. He still believed that the enslaved people would rise up, that God would intervene. He was wrong. On the evening of October 17th, a company of U.S. Marines arrived in Harper's Ferry, commanded by Colonel Robert E. Lee, with Lieutenant J.E.B. Stewart as his second-in-command. The irony was extraordinary. Lee, who would later command the Confederate Army fighting to preserve slavery, was now leading the force to capture Brown. Lee decided on an assault at dawn. On the morning of October 18th, Stewart approached the engine house under a white flag and demanded Brown's surrender. Brown demanded safe passage out of Virginia. Stewart refused. The only option was unconditional surrender. Brown refused. Stewart stepped back and waved his hat, the signal for the assault to begin. A dozen Marines rushed the engine house. They battered down the door using a ladder as a ram and poured through the breach. A brief, violent firefight erupted. Brown's son Oliver was mortally wounded, crying out, "Father, I'm dying," before collapsing. Lieutenant Green found John Brown reloading his rifle and attacked him with his sword, striking him multiple times. Brown went down, bleeding from head wounds but alive. Within minutes, the fight was over. The Marines had captured Brown and 6 others. Remarkably, all the hostages survived. Brown was pulled from the engine house, bleeding and semi-conscious. He was laid on the grass, and a crowd gathered to see the famous John Brown. Virginia Governor Henry Wise arrived and began questioning Brown while he lay wounded. What happened next was remarkable. Despite being injured, defeated, and facing certain execution, John Brown gave one of the most powerful performances of his life. When asked why he had attacked Harpers Ferry, Brown stated calmly that he came to free slaves, which was his divine duty. When accused of murder and treason, Brown accepted the charges but insisted his actions were morally justified because slavery itself was murder. When told he would hang, Brown said he was prepared to die for the cause of freedom. The interrogation was witnessed by journalists. Their accounts of Brown's calm defiance, his moral certainty, his willingness to die for his beliefs electrified the nation. This wasn't a ranting fanatic. This was a man of absolute conviction. The South was horrified. The North was divided between those who condemned his violence and those who secretly admired his courage. Brown was charged with treason against Virginia, murder, and inciting slave rebellion. His trial began just 1 week after his capture, on October 25th. Brown was still recovering from his wounds and had to be carried into the courtroom on a cot. The trial was a formality. The evidence against Brown was overwhelming, but Brown used the trial as a platform. When allowed to address the court, he delivered speeches that were published in newspapers across the country. He insisted that slavery was a crime against God and man, that violence against slavery was justified, that he had no regrets except that he hadn't freed more people. On November 2nd, 1859, the jury deliberated for just 45 minutes before returning a guilty verdict on all charges. Judge Richard Parker sentenced John Brown to hang on December 2nd. Brown listened to the sentence without emotion, then made his final statement to the court, words that would echo through history. I have, may it please the court, a few words to say. In the first place, I deny everything but what I have all along admitted, the design on my part to free the slaves. I intended to have made a clean thing of that matter. That was all I intended. I never did intend murder, or treason, or the destruction of property, or to excite or incite slaves to rebellion. Brown paused, then continued with the words that would transform him into a martyr. Now, if it is deemed necessary that I should forfeit my life for the furtherance of the ends of justice, and mingle my blood further with the blood of my children, and with the blood of millions in this slave country whose rights are disregarded by wicked, cruel, and unjust enactments, I submit, so let it be done. These words were published in newspapers across America. In the North, many who had condemned Brown's violence now saw him differently. Here was a man willing to die for what he believed was right. Church bells rang in his honor. Prayer meetings were held. Poets wrote tributes. Ralph Waldo Emerson compared Brown to Jesus Christ. The South was terrified. If Brown was a hero in the North, if people were holding vigils for a man who had tried to start a slave rebellion, then the Union was finished. Southern newspapers called Brown a terrorist and a murderer. When many Northern states praised Brown instead of condemning him, Southern politicians began seriously discussing secession. Brown spent his final month in jail reading the Bible, writing letters, and receiving visitors. His letters from this period are remarkable, showing a man at peace with his approaching death, convinced that his hanging would do more to end slavery than his raid ever could. He wrote to his family, "I am worth now infinitely more to die than to live." On the morning of December 2nd, 1859, John Brown was taken from his cell and placed in a wagon with his coffin. He rode sitting on the coffin to the gallows. 1,500 soldiers surrounded the execution site, testimony to how much Virginia feared Brown's influence. Among the soldiers watching were 2 men who would later face each other in the Civil War, John Wilkes Booth and Stonewall Jackson. Brown climbed the gallows steps calmly. When asked if he wanted a hood over his head, he refused, saying he wanted to see the sky. The noose was placed around his neck. There was a delay while soldiers continued taking positions. Brown stood on the gallows for over 10 minutes, waiting to die. Finally, at 11:15 a.m., the trap door opened, and John Brown dropped to his death. His body hung for 37 minutes before being cut down. Thousands attended memorial services across the North. Church bells tolled. Businesses closed. In many northern cities, the day of Brown's execution was treated like a national day of mourning. On the morning of his execution, John Brown had handed a final note to one of his guards. It read, "I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood." 18 months after Brown's execution, Fort Sumter was fired upon, and the Civil War began. Brown's prophecy came true. The crimes of this guilty land would indeed be purged with blood, the blood of over 600,000 Americans who died in the war that finally ended slavery. Union soldiers marched into battle singing "John Brown's Body," a song that transformed Brown into an avenging spirit leading the fight against slavery. So who was John Brown? Terrorist or freedom fighter? Madman or prophet? The answer depends on what you believe about violence, justice, and the fight against oppression. To the South, and many in the North at the time, Brown was a terrorist, a fanatic who murdered innocent people in Kansas and tried to start a race war at Harpers Ferry. His actions were condemned by most mainstream political leaders, including Abraham Lincoln, who called the Harpers Ferry raid wrong for two reasons: it was a violation of law, and it was futile. But to many abolitionists, particularly Black Americans, Brown was a hero. Frederick Douglass, who had refused to join the Harpers Ferry raid, later wrote, "His zeal in the cause of my race was far greater than mine. I could live for the slave, but he could die for him." Brown was the only white man in America willing to die fighting to free Black people. The raid itself was a tactical disaster, but a strategic success. Brown failed to spark a slave rebellion. He failed to hold Harpers Ferry. He and his men were killed or captured. But the raid accomplished something more important. It made civil war inevitable. The South realized that there were Northerners willing to use violence to end slavery. The North realized that slavery wouldn't end through political compromise. Both sides began preparing for war. The question Brown forces us to confront is this: when is violence justified in fighting injustice? Brown believed that slavery was such an absolute evil that violence was not only justified, but morally necessary. He couldn't understand people who said they opposed slavery but weren't willing to fight and die to end it. But Brown's violence also killed people who, while complicit in slavery, weren't slaveholders themselves. The men killed at Pottawatomie Creek were pro-slavery settlers, but they hadn't personally enslaved anyone. Was their murder justified? Brown thought so. Most people, then and now, disagree. The Civil War vindicated Brown's central argument: slavery would not end peacefully. Lincoln initially fought the war to preserve the Union, not to end slavery. But by 1863, with the Emancipation Proclamation, the war became explicitly about ending slavery. The Union armies that marched south were doing exactly what Brown had tried to do at Harpers Ferry, using violence to destroy slavery by force. The difference was scale. Brown had 21 men. Lincoln had 2 million. Today, John Brown's farm in North Elba, New York, is a historic site. The engine house at Harpers Ferry has been preserved. Thousands of tourists visit each year, trying to understand the man who tried to start a war to end slavery. Brown's legacy is complicated. He was right that slavery was evil. He was right that it wouldn't end peacefully. He was right that it would take blood to purge that evil from America. But he was also a killer who murdered unarmed men in front of their families. He was a man whose absolute moral certainty led him to commit acts that most people find horrifying. Perhaps the most important thing about John Brown is that he forces us to think about uncomfortable questions we'd rather avoid. When is violence justified? What would you die for? What would you kill for? If you lived in 1859 and genuinely believed slavery was evil, what would you have done? Would you have risked your life? Would you have taken up arms? Or would you have written angry letters and hoped someone else would take action? John Brown didn't write letters. He took action. He fought. He killed. He died. And within 2 years of his death, the nation was at war, fighting over the question of slavery. The abolitionist, who led an armed rebellion, failed in his immediate goal, but succeeded in forcing America to confront its original sin. The blood he shed was just the beginning. The blood of 600,000 would follow. And when it was over, 4 million people were free. John Brown's body lies moldering in the grave, but his soul goes marching on.